I'm very excited to be here today to talk about policymaking and what that means. And like Taylor said, really hoping to have a discussion and hope people are engaged on the chat so that it's more of a dialogue than just me talking at everybody. So just start with a little bit of background about Children's Law Center, where I work. So we are the largest nonprofit child law firm in the nation. We represent about 35,000 children and youth, and we hold the contracts in Los Angeles, Sacramento, and Placer. So in California, every child has a right to an attorney when a case is open in the dependency court, which generally happens when a child has been removed from their parents. So the parents have an attorney, the state has an attorney, and then the child has an attorney. And so we serve as the court-appointed attorney for the child. The vast majority of what we do is in-court representation. So we have several hundred attorneys who represent children. And then we do have this little small policy department, which is where I work. And we work on more macro level change, working at, like Taylor said, the local, state, and federal level to try to make changes in the laws or changes in policy that benefit our clients kind of as a whole. And we've been doing that for many years. And you can see a bottom bullet that we've sponsored or co-sponsored over 40 pieces of child welfare legislation in California over the last 20 years. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So this is my kind of definition. Lots of people say, what do you do? And it's very hard to describe what I do. I mean, I think sometimes I say I'm, a lobbyist for children in foster care, for lack of a better way to describe what I do. But really what I do is try to work on child welfare reform. And this is a definition that I made up, but it's really changes or improvements to laws or policies that have a direct benefit for the children and families that we serve. And that's what I do. And just a little bit of background about my experience. So I've been at CLC since 2005, since I graduated law school. I started doing a fellowship here where I was working with youth who were crossing between the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system, which you probably talked about at some point. Sometimes those youth are referred to as crossover youth, sometimes they're referred to as dual status or dually involved. And so that's how I started. And then I went in the courtroom and I carried a caseload for 6 years and got that experience. And then I left the courtroom to work on more macro level policy. And I think for me as kind of a policymaker, that direct experience in court is critical for me understanding the landscape. I think lots of people, politicians, legislative staff, even advocates, lots of people have never stepped in a courtroom. They've never represented a child and they don't really understand how it functions. And so I think for me personally and in my career trajectory, having that practical experience has been really important for me to then go into the policy world to try to make those more macro level changes. And here's just an example of some of our sponsored bills. I'm going to talk later about what we're working on right now, but here's kind of an example just of a few of the bills that we've worked on that I think have had a direct impact and change on the lives of the children we serve. One of them established a right for children in care to participate in age-appropriate extracurricular activities. Prior to this bill, if a child wanted to be part of a sports team or wanted to travel with their school or anything like that, lots of times you had to get a court order. There was a big hurdle and it didn't happen. And so so this just gives, which seems common sense, but we had to do a law to give caregivers the right to make certain decisions. They don't need to go to the social worker every time. They can give a child normalcy in their home, which is really what we want for all of the kids we serve. Another bill we have allows for a reversal in the termination of parental rights. So this was a really big change in the law. So what happens in the child welfare system, as hopefully you guys have talked about, is if a child doesn't get returned to parents, you're looking at a permanent plan. And if the permanent plan is adoption, there's a permanent termination of that parent-child relationship. But sometimes we see those adoptions fail, they don't go through, and then you have a child who's considered a legal orphan. And we started to see situations where parents have come back into the child's life many, many years later. And so now we have an opportunity in the law to reverse the termination of parental rights. And both of these bills, the extracurricular activities and the termination of parental rights, both of these bills are now being considered at the federal level. So California was kind of ahead of the game, and CLC sponsored these. I didn't work on these personally, but other people who were working on policy at the time were really ahead of the game in passing these bills, and they're now becoming more common all over the country. AB 12 was a big bill, extending foster care to age 21. We worked on that with a number of co-sponsors. And then something that I've worked on a lot recently is reducing some of the hurdles to relative placement, especially when we're talking about relatives who have a criminal history. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So where do we begin in policy? So this is, the very start of how you want to make a change is to recognize the issue. What is the problem in existing law or policy that we need to work on? And there's different ways that we do that. One is identifying patterns in our work. And I mentioned this at the beginning. I think we are really well situated for that because we have the benefit of having many people on our staff who are practitioners. They're in the court, they're seeing the problems day to day, and they might start seeing trends, and then they bring those trends to our attention and say, hey, we really think this needs a fix because we're seeing this problem over and over again. Talking to other advocates and organizations, looking at the data. So what does the data tell us? And if it's concerning, we need to start thinking about whether there's a problem. And then listening to the children and youth we serve. Of course, that's critical. We always want to base everything on what our clients are saying and feeling and what makes sense from their perspective. So the next step, so you identify the issue, the next step is figuring out the solution. And I think this is really the hardest part of policy. So what are we going to do to solve the problem? Once we've found the issue, what are we going to do to solve the problem? And I'm going to talk about an example issue. And I think this is one that's already been addressed in your classes, talking about race and child welfare and race equity and some of the issues of disproportionality. And I put on here a chart that has the breakdown, and LA County releases this once a month. So they release a chart with all this data every month. And one of the things that's included is child characteristics. And so you can see kind of the racial breakdown, the ethnic breakdown of the child welfare population in LA County. And then going to the next slide, I compared that breakdown to the general population in LA County. And this is what we call overrepresentation or disproportionality. So you'll see there's an underrepresentation of certain ethnic groups like white children or Asian Pacific Islander children, where the general population, that orange bar, is greater percentage-wise than the population in child welfare. And then you see an overrepresentation of certain groups. Hispanic children are overrepresented in foster care. And this is actually new. For many, many years, Hispanic children were represented fairly similar to their representation in the general population. But in recent data, there's now kind of a slight overrepresentation of Hispanic children in the child welfare system, and then Black children are significantly overrepresented in the child welfare system. So this is an issue, and we've all known this to be an issue for a long time. And so we talked about in our first slide, we've identified the issue. We have a disproportionate representation of certain groups of children in child welfare. So now comes the next step, which is what's the solution? And I think this is like I said, this is the hardest part, is figuring out what to do. And just as an exercise, just curious if anyone in this group has any ideas on how you solve this problem. If you do, write them in the chat. I would love to know, kind of looking first glance at this issue, what you think might be a way to address the disproportionate representation of Black and Hispanic children in the child welfare system. And I'm going to pause just for a minute to see if anyone wants to take a stab at a solution. Blind removal sounds promising. Universal income, healthcare for all. So that's great. Thinking of the broader issues, right? Maybe it's not just specific to child welfare. Maybe it's a broader systemic issue. We have to look broader than child welfare to solve the problem. Any other ideas? Proper living wage. Thank you. These are all great ideas, and in all things, I think we've addressing the social ecology that comes out of low socioeconomic status. These are all really great solutions and great thoughts on how we address the disproportionality that's been a problem in child welfare for as long as I've been practicing, and I'm sure much longer. So what now? Sorry, that was my slide for us to talk about it. So blind removal. So someone brought up blind removal, and that's something that we've, in the child welfare space, we've been talking about for many years. And it's obviously getting more attention right now. But it's something I learned about many years ago and was wondering why aren't we trying this in more counties? Like Nassau County started this pilot. They use this kind of blind removal process where a panel of social workers look at an investigation is done on abuse or neglect by an investigating social worker. The social worker writes up a report, presents it to a panel of social workers, but all of any information that would reveal the child's race or ethnicity is redacted. And then they make a decision together about whether or not the family should be separated. And in this pilot program, they saw some pretty extreme reductions in the number of Black families who are being separated. And so certainly seems like something at first glance that we should be looking at to address disproportionality. And so it's something CLC's talked about for many years. And this year we really wanted to see it move forward. And so we had to start thinking about, okay, problem, disproportionality, potential solution, implementing blind removal. Now what? What's the next step? How do we get that to actually happen? And so strategies to making change. So there's a few different ways that a few different avenues that we can use within CLC to try to make change. One, of course, is the court system. So this is individual case advocacy stuff that we do every day. We can take cases up to the appellate court to try to change the law that would go statewide. Class actions, which is when you bring a whole bunch of plaintiffs in if you're seeing the same problem over and over again and file a lawsuit that way. And then also working with elected officials at all levels of government to try to make change, local, county, state, federal. And so we're going to walk through kind of what that looks like. I'm not going to talk about the court advocacy, more focused on the policy for this training. But if you're interested in court advocacy, I'm happy to talk another time. You can reach out to me. So local advocacy. So I have a quiz for everyone. Who is the governing body of the County of Los Angeles? Who controls what happens in LA County? Anyone have any idea? Board of Supervisors, yay. That's right, the Board of Supervisors. And then just a guess, what do you think our budget is in LA County? How much money do you think the Board of Supervisors are controlling? Anyone have any guess? $2 billion, $5 billion, billions. Yep, okay. So we know the next slide. So that's right. The LA County Board of Supervisors they are the body that is in charge of what happens in LA County, and their budget is $34 billion. That is a huge budget. It's bigger than some states. So there's a lot of authority and a lot of money they're controlling. And for the first time ever, now that Holly Mitchell was just voted into office, we have 5 women as the Board of Supervisors. Just a little back in the day, many years ago, they used to call the Board of Supervisors the 5 Little Kings because there were 5 men and they controlled a huge budget, largely unchecked. And so they were called the 5 Little Kings. Of course, that looks very different now that we have 5 women. But similarly, they are controlling a very large budget. There's 5 of them, and they are limited to 3 4-year terms. So that's actually quite a bit of time, 12-year term limit. And they control they control the budget in LA County, and you'll see here kind of what that budget looked like last year. This is a breakdown that came from their budget. I see lots of wows. Yeah, definitely a lot of wows. And definitely, I think something, what I've learned in my position is local policy matters a lot. We talk a lot about who's the president's going to be and the vice president, and that's all over the news. Very few people actually know who their local politicians are. Who's your board supervisor? Who's your city council member? Who's your assembly member in the state level? Who's your state senator? Those decisions at the local and state level, they actually probably impact our lives more on a daily basis than what happens at the federal level. But really what we hear about on the news and what people know about is what's happening at the federal level. So just, if you're interested in getting more involved and knowing what's happened on the day-to-day, I definitely recommend you learn more about local politics, because I think you can see a lot of change happen that way. Okay, so local politics, blind removal. Just last week, Holly Mitchell, who's a supervisor, she was a state senator, she's now a board supervisor. She introduced a motion that is directing LA County to implement a blind removal pilot. And that was done, this motion was definitely done with some advocacy. So, people reaching out to Holly Mitchell's office and saying, hey, this is something that's really important. We've reached out to DCFS. We want them to try it. We haven't gotten any movement. We'd really love your support in pushing this forward. And so that's the kind of advocacy you can see at the local level. Taylor Dudley used to work in an office, in a board supervisor office. She's incredibly knowledgeable on local politics and has been really helpful for me to learn more about how things work. And also in this motion, it directs the Child Welfare Agency, DCFS, to work with the UCLA Pritzker Center on studying blind removal, on doing research. So it's really a great motion, and it's just an example of how you can get things moving and make an impact at the local level. And then if you see I can send Taylor these slides. The bottom right has a link to this whole motion if anyone's interested in reading the entire motion and what DCFS was directed to do. Okay, now let's talk about state advocacy. Any questions? I'll just stop there. Any questions, comments, thoughts on kind of local advocacy before we move to the state level? And something to know is every Tuesday, the Board of Supervisors has a meeting that's open to the public, and they put out an agenda with all these motions. And you can look through and see, are there any motions that are relevant to things that you're interested in, and you can make public comment. You can call the office and weigh in. And if there isn't a motion and you want a motion, you can reach out to your board supervisor and ask for a meeting. So really it's, what I also didn't realize before I started this job is it's not that hard to get involved. You just have to know how to do it and who to talk to. Okay, seeing no questions, I'm going to move on.
Sorry, Sue, before you move on, I just want to thank you for highlighting the blind removal work. And thank you for talking about the work that Holly Mitchell has directed DCFS to do. For students who are interested in, learning more about this or talking more about it, I would invite you to join us at office hours tomorrow. I'm happy to talk more about the blind removal process and what the UCLA Pritzker Center will be doing in partnership with the county to evaluate the effectiveness. And a lot of you have been asking me about, opportunities to get involved. We will have some students working on this project. But if anybody's interested more, please see us in office hours. And if that doesn't work, let me know and we'll find another time to talk. Thank you.
Okay. So moving on to state advocacy. So how do you advocate at the state level? So there's a few different ways you can do it. One is looking at their policies and seeing if we need to either change policies or develop new policies or get rid of policies. The state issues tons of regulations related to kind of every different field, but in child welfare, it all comes from the same office, and you can sign up and you get emailed a draft regulation and you can make comments on it. There's also budget advocacy, which is a huge opportunity. You can go in and ask for money to support something. And then the last is legislation, and hopefully everyone knows how a bill is made. If you don't, you can watch that little How a Bill Becomes a Law cartoon, which is actually really, it's exactly how the process works. And so I think it's a good way to learn about making legislation. So we do all three of these. And kind of talk about strategies for advocacy. So these are the strategies that we use. So first is building a coalition. That is key, and we do it on a lot of bills. We co-sponsor a lot of bills, especially if we can find organizations that are outside of child welfare, or even in different, sometimes we work with the parents' firms, or sometimes we work with the organization that represents the county agencies, because it shows that there's widespread support for whatever we're asking for, and that support is coming from different fields and different stakeholders. So have a clear message, include written materials. You can even draft the proposed changes to the law. This is almost always what we do. So we come up with, we have an idea, but we spot the issue, and then we have an idea for how to fix the issue, and then we write the actual changes to the law that we want to see, and then we shop it around to different legislators. And there are some legislators who are kind of known to support child welfare. So usually we start with those legislators, and we go and we request meetings, and you either are going to get a meeting directly with the legislator or usually with their staff. And again, this is way easier than I ever thought it was. It's super easy to request a meeting, and you will always get a meeting, especially if the legislator is in your jurisdiction and you're a constituent. And then you say to them, like, we have this idea, we're trying to find someone to author the bill. The legislators are bill authors. The organizations that are working with the legislators are called sponsors, bill sponsors. And so you're looking for an author, and so you kind of shop it around. And then hopefully you find a legislator to introduce your bill. And once that happens, you kind of go through the process where it goes through the bill hearings. And lots of times you have to amend it because people have concerns or think it'll work a different way. And then it goes through the process until it goes to the governor to get signed. So that's kind of how we work on legislation. The last few bullets are rely on experts, rely on data and research. That's always really helpful if you have experts or data and research to support your position. And then lastly, use the media. I think this is especially helpful when you have an issue that's a little bit controversial. And I will turn back to blind removal because that has been a little controversial. So CLC, before the Holly Mitchell motion, CLC was working with some other co-sponsors on a bill on legislation to try to establish a pot of money at the state level where 5 counties could opt into the pot of money to create blind removal pilots in their counties. And we actually were met with a lot of opposition from the very beginning. Opposition from county agencies and labor organizations, and the opposition came in a few different forms, but mainly stemmed from a notion that the Nassau County pilot mostly had white social workers. But in California and the counties we were looking at, the social work, the demographics of the social workers was much more diverse. And so what happened in Nassau County wouldn't necessarily happen in LA County because the social workers don't have the same kind of bias because they have a more diverse demographic. That was kind of the gist of the opposition. And then also there were some concerns about child safety and how's this going to work, and it's going to be expensive. And so, because of that opposition, we had to pause the bill and turn it into a 2-year bill. So that means that it's still in a committee, it didn't get out of the committee, and we have to go back at it next year. So that's kind of the challenges that we're facing with blind removal. Well, with this recent motion, there's been a ton of press, and it's been getting in the media, and we're actually getting a much stronger response from the legislature. So once the media started talking about this, some legislative staff reached out to us to say, hey, are you guys planning to push the bill again next year, because our members are reading all this, this media, and this is getting a lot of news attention, and they might be more interested this year in getting it passed. So that's kind of a direct example of when the media can really help move an issue, because it might motivate certain legislators to do it, even if there might be some controversy or some pushback. So here's some of the bills we're working on this year. And we've really tried to be, the way that we decide what we're working on is we have a legislative committee and we meet monthly, and people give ideas, and we have a very long list of ideas. So every year we have like 25 ideas, which we will never have 25 bills. it's impossible. But we try to you know, my goal is always 4, it always ends up being 6. But we try to, you know, pick kind of which ones we think are the most critical, the most timely, and then also politically and strategically, what makes sense to do right now? Where are we? What's the landscape, and what do we think we can get through? And so, you know, this year we tried to be we tried to be strategic and cohesive and have most of our bills be related to kind of disproportionality and disparity in the child welfare system. And so in disproportionality, we talked about, it means overrepresentation. Disparity means outcomes are worse than for other groups. So in addition to the problem of disproportionality, we also have an issue with disparity in the child welfare system, specifically with Black families, where we see fewer families being reunified. We see fewer kids going to permanency, which means that we have more Black children exiting foster care without a permanent plan, and then falling into some of those statistics of homelessness or criminal justice system that we hear about in the child welfare system. And so our bills this year, we really tried to tailor it towards addressing both disproportionality and disparity in the child welfare system, and then some other issues that have come up that we thought were needing attention this year. And so you'll see our bills. The first one is about blind removal, which we already talked about, and you can see we co-sponsored that. We're co-sponsoring it with a few other organizations. As I mentioned, it's turned into a 2-year bill. So every bill cycle is 2 years. So if you introduce a bill in the beginning of a 2-year cycle, you have 2 years to get it through. If you introduce the second year, you only have 1 year to get it through. And sometimes that's strategic. If you know a bill might get opposition, you want to start at the beginning of a 2-year cycle so you have time to work on the opposition and to try to get it through, to do the kind of lobbying that you need to get support and to get it through. And so that has turned into a 2-year bill. Another bill we're working on is, and AB means Assembly Bill and SB means Senate Bill. That just means it started on that side of the House. So if a senator introduces it, it's going to be SB. If an assembly member introduces it, it's going to be AB. And then it starts in those houses. And once it gets through those houses, it switches to the other side, goes through the second house, and then goes to the governor for signature. So SB 354 is a bill that we're working on with many other groups, and it's a great coalition because it has lots of groups. It has groups from kind of criminal justice world, it has county agency representation, and then also some child advocacy firms, CLC and the Alliance for Children's Rights. And that bill really trying to address some of the barriers to relative placement we see when the relatives have a criminal history. We, you know, talked about, I mean, for many years known this, but I think it's getting a lot of attention in the past year or two that there's systemic racism in the child welfare system. And then if you're using criminal history to determine whether a relative can provide a safe home for a child, you're bringing that into the child welfare system. And so what we see is many children have families who are trying to get placement, but because of their criminal history, they're not able to. And so we're really trying to overhaul the way that we evaluate relatives in looking at whether they're a safe placement for a child, not depend so much on their criminal history, and instead look at other things that we should be looking at, like what does the child want? How connected is the child to the relative? Does the relative have, you know, has a relative raised other children or have other children in their home who are safe, and do they provide a loving home? So kind of the things that we should be focusing on instead of criminal history. So that's another bill we're working on this year. AB 670 has to do with our parenting foster youth. So we represent several hundred youth who are parents themselves, and those children are at much greater risk than anybody else for having their family separated and having their children removed. And so we're trying to make sure that they get the support they need to be able to provide a safe home for their children. And sorry, I didn't say this. This bill is still moving this year, as is the relative placement bill. So only of the 3 I talked about, only the blind removal has been held to a 2-year bill. We're also working on a bill that would provide us notice when our clients have been either suspended or somehow disciplined in school. And this came out of a research project where they found that Black boys and Black boys in foster care in particular were way, way more likely than any other group to be suspended from school. And looking at the data, we're talking about very young kids, like 5, 6. And so, these kids have trauma, and the response by the education system is to discipline them instead of helping them and providing the right services and support. And so our bill would just give us notice when there's any disciplinary action taken against one of our clients. That bill also turned into a 2-year bill, not because of any opposition in particular, but because the education committees this year were so overwhelmed with COVID that they said no bills are going to get through this year unless they have to do directly with COVID. And if they don't, we're going to push it to next year. And then we have 2 more bills. One is on access to immigration counsel. And then the other was around making sure our clients have access to sexual and reproductive health information and services, but it got put into the budget. So that's one strategy, is when you get language and you put it into the budget. So it was put into the budget. So we got to entirely amend the bill, and now it's about sibling placement and sibling rights. Happy to talk more about any of these bills if anyone's interested. Just wanted to give you kind of a snapshot of what that looks like. And I'll pause to see if anyone has any questions about state policy or legislation or advocating, anything like that. Okay, not seeing any questions. Oh, can you talk more about how a bill gets put into a budget? Yes, definitely. So at the end, every year at the end of June, the government and the legislature have to come out together with a budget. And the budget is often, when a budget's released, it's often comes with some language on how to implement the budget. So an example could be blind removal. Let's say we wanted to get in the budget. We don't want it to be a bill, we want it to be in the budget. What we would do is have a budget ask, and we would say, okay, we need $40 million to create this pot of money for counties to opt in to be able to implement blind removal policies. And so you're asking for the budget, but then you have draft language changes to law that go along with that budget ask. And so that's the way sometimes you get, even though it's changes to policy, you get it into the law without it being legislation through the budget. Hopefully that made sense. It's complicated, and it's the way we do a lot of business, because anything that has a lot of money attached to it usually needs to come through the budget. And so it's one way, and oftentimes you're working simultaneously. So you'll introduce a bill because you don't want to lose that as an option, but you'll also be trying to get into the budget. And so you'll know right around the end of June whether or not you made it into the budget. And if you did, you either let the bill die, or you can what's called gut and amend, which you completely change the bill to be a whole nother bill because you've already gotten what you wanted in the bill in the law through the budget. Hopefully that made sense. And please ask me follow-up questions if it didn't. When these bills receive opposition, what does it usually sound like? So I have a slide that shows a little more about when we oppose, but it can come in a few different ways. So generally, you'll call the office. You'll start by trying to, it depends how much you're opposed to something. If something's just awful and offensive, lots of times you'll just write a letter immediately to the committee saying that you oppose the bill, and that will give you an opportunity to testify in a hearing. And so that's one way to make your opposition known. Another way is to try to work with either the sponsors or the author. So either an advocacy group like us or the legislative office, to try to get them to amend the bill to a way that you feel more comfortable with. So those are the ways that generally you start with opposition. And there's certain groups like labor groups, SEIU, they're really well known to all legislative staff. So if they're going to come out opposed to your bill, it's a big deal. And lots of times they just need to make a phone call and say, hey, we have concerns with this bill, in order to kind of either stop the process altogether or make the author stop and think and offer amendments and try to work with SEIU to change the bill so they won't oppose. So those are the ways that you generally will oppose a bill. Either start by calling the author or sponsor, or you just directly write to a committee and say, I'm opposed to this bill. And something like the, one of maybe 2 years ago is when California passed the law that required vaccines in school. And that was a super controversial bill with a lot of opposition. And so those hearings would last for hours and hours because you have anybody can go and testify and oppose a bill. Anybody can do it. And so you have lots of people flying to Sacramento and making public comment and writing letters in opposition. And all of that happens in the committees. So a bill moves through committees, and in those committees is where you have the opportunity to weigh in. Okay, implementation is a key piece to any reform effort. I just like to remind people and anyone who's interested in going into policy that once you get the law passed, you've only started. You have to finish it by making sure that it gets implemented on the ground. And that's a huge piece of change. And I think, we have lots and lots of good laws on the books, but they don't happen in practice. And that's a big problem. So sometimes as policymakers, some years we never don't sponsor any bills, but we may only sponsor 1 or 2 because we say, okay, we're going to spend a lot of time this year on implementation. Like AB 12 is a good example, the bill that extended foster care from 18 to 21. That was such a big change in the state, such a big change in the county, that we really spent a lot of time focusing on implementation. How is this going to work in practice? We went around to different placements and talked to kids and encouraged them to stay in foster care past 18 so they could access the benefits. So we did a lot of work on making sure that on the ground, the changes in the law were being followed and were being taken advantage of. And so I just wanted to put that in your ear that, getting the law passed or changed or getting a change to policy is only one piece of the puzzle. You have to also work on implementation. Playing defense. So we talked about opposition. So that's something we do at CLC also. I actually think it's as important as passing bills or changing policy. Making sure that something doesn't go into law or policy that's harmful for our clients is incredibly important. And, we work in foster care. Foster care is a bipartisan issue. Oftentimes it comes from a good place. People aren't trying to intentionally harm children, but sometimes they just don't know what the impact will be on the ground. And so we have to follow, at least 100 bills a year, bills that are related to criminal justice system, bills that are related to education, bills that are specific to child welfare. We have to follow these bills to make sure that our clients aren't going to be unintentionally harmed if the bill gets through and it has language that might cause an issue in the courts or on the ground. And so that's a big part of our job. And I put in an example here of a letter that we wrote in opposition. So somebody asked how you oppose something. So this is a letter that we wrote to the assemblywoman who was working on a bill. Her name is Lorena Gonzalez. And her bill was about mandated reporting and establishing that any volunteer in a youth organization who volunteers over a certain number of hours has to become a mandated reporter. And that sounds okay. And it comes from a good place. They really want to make sure that youth who are participating in youth organizations are protected. There's been a lot of things coming out in the media about sex abuse that's happening in youth organizations that was going unreported. And so the response is, okay, let's make volunteers mandated reporters. Of course, there's a whole other side to mandated reporting. Lots of studies have shown there's lots of bias in mandated reporting. It results in families of color being scrutinized and potentially leads to more cases opening. And our concern is, okay, you have these youth volunteers and you're saying you're going to become a mandated reporter. If you're a mandated reporter, it's actually a crime not to report abuse, but then you're not providing them with any training or any implicit bias training. And so we really were concerned about the potential implications of having this huge new group of people who are volunteers becoming mandated reporters without having the right kind of training. And so we weighed in opposition, and this is what our letter looked like. You can just see the start of it. But, we went on to describe why we have concerns about the bill and what we think would help if it was amended, what would help and what would make us remove our opposition and ultimately she was very upset about this, but Lorena Gonzalez did amend the bill, and we did pull our opposition. So this is just an example of the kind of like defense that we have to play just to make sure that bills aren't getting through that might have some unintended consequences.
Hey, Sue, really quick. I just want to point out something that you mentioned that might have been overlooked by the students. And that is the idea of pointing out a problem and then offering a solution. And that's something that I think CLC is really good at. And that's largely under your leadership that CLC does that, which is to say, like, look, here's the problem with what you've proposed. It could result in, more kids coming into the system. It could result in people experiencing some kind of liability that's not anticipated. But if you change it in this way, and this way, it will be better. And I think that's such a important skill to note as, students and prospective policymakers or folks looking to be involved with the legislative process, that any one of us could say, like, that's bad, that's dumb, I don't like that idea. But then you have to have something better in place of that idea. And that's what really makes for, I think, a more informed populace and a more informed democracy is if we can put forward, solutions to the problems that we see. So thanks for flagging that. And again, just want to really point that out to the students that, as you think about all of the problems that we've shared with you in the course of the academy about the child welfare system, we're looking to you to also, be thinking about solutions in the same way that we do at the center. So being solution minded is so important. And I just wanted to offer that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think both in terms of making things better, like if you wanted to say a certain thing, then you should offer that. And also politically, like most of the time, these offices really do want to help. And so you want to, Lorena Gonzalez she's the chair of appropriations, which means she has a lot of sway. She decides which bills get through appropriations, which is all about money. And that's a very, it's considered a leadership position. And so, and she was coming from the right place. I mean, she wanted to put something into law that would be more protective of kids. So oftentimes you really do want to try to work with the offices in the best way you can. And so I think, and just to give you some perspective, at this point, when we submitted this letter, we had already talked to her office several times. So we tried to do it even without having to submit a letter, but we weren't getting anywhere and we were nearing the end of the cycle. And so we were worried, like if we don't put our opposition in writing and put it on the record, it's not going to impact the bill. And so I think that's why we ultimately decided we had to submit a letter. But again, like Taylor said, we put oppose unless amended, and we offered some amendments that we thought would resolve the issue. So I'm going to stop quickly for two questions that I see here. So one is, I'm interested in how organizations that work with children are listening to each other and cooperating and pushing forward beneficial policies for children in the welfare system. How closely do we work with education groups like Teachers Union? So that's a great question. I would say the advocacy organizations in the child welfare space are very collaborative. During the legislative season, we meet weekly to talk to each other about what bills we're working on, what opposition we have. We flag bills for each other. So lots of times people from other organizations will text me and say, have you taken a look at this? And so I think we rely on each other a lot. In terms of other disciplines, we haven't been as good at that. And I think we really are trying to branch out because that's really important. And you'll see that just generally, like these worlds are really siloed and they really need to be more collaborative, right? Like what happens in the education system is so important in our clients' lives, and yet we're not working closely enough. And so I think there's a lot of effort right now to create more collaboration within the different disciplines. But I'd say within child welfare, we definitely are very collaborative. What are the strategies for effective implementation? That's also a great question. So I think there's lots of different things you can do. Of course, training being the first one, and making sure that training is statewide and getting to all the different players. I think another, so we've had some, like, I'll give you an example of a bill. So we worked on a bill, and this was our original bill was about making sure our clients have access to reproductive and sexual health information and services. And in order to see if that was being implemented effectively, we hired several youth who had experienced foster care to go into the courts and to interview our clients, to talk to them about whether or not they were able to get the information and services they need, the reproductive health information and services they need. And then with that, we looked at the results and saw that it really was not happening as often as it should have been. And so we took that information to the Child Welfare Agency and said, hey, you guys need to think of something different for your social workers because this is not happening on the ground. And then we went back and forth with them, and they offered a number of different ways that they were going to work on ensuring their social workers were getting the right training and were making sure that our clients had the services and information. So I think it can, implementation can be a number of different things. Also making sure our attorneys know what's going on and are holding people accountable. So, an example is our clients, many of our clients have they're victims of identity theft, whether it's from their biological families, sometimes from foster families. They end up leaving foster care, trying to get an apartment, and then find out that their credit has been used and they have all these awful problems. And so many years ago, the law was changed to require child welfare agencies, when our clients turn 16, to run their credit and make sure that nobody's using their credit. It never happens. It just doesn't happen. It's in the law, it doesn't happen. And so part of it is getting our attorneys to make sure they're also noticing, like, okay, our clients have turned 16. Does the report talk about their credit? If it doesn't, ask the court to make an order that the social worker run their credit like they're required to do under the law. So some of it is also having our attorneys make sure the law is followed. Some of it's training everybody, all the court partners, the judges and the social workers and the attorneys for the children, parents in the agency. So there's lots of different ways to work on implementation, and really it's just kind of a case-by-case situation depending on what you're working on, what issue you're working on. Okay, leaving state advocacy, unless there are more questions, I'll pause for a minute. And turning to federal advocacy. So this is trying to make changes at the federal level. This is definitely still it's still kind of a black hole for me. It's in California, everything is very transparent. We have a website that lists every single bill that's been introduced. It shows you all the different versions of the bill that have been amended. It shows you how the bill's moved, where the bill is, like what committee, when it's being heard, how you can weigh in. So it's all very transparent. It's very easy to follow. Federal legislation works totally differently. Lots of things are done behind closed doors. There's a bill that's moving around different offices, but it's not published anywhere. Nobody really knows what it says. And then all of a sudden it comes out. And so it's much more difficult to weigh in at the federal level, but we've certainly tried. And then another thing about federal advocacy is the federal government, especially when it comes to foster care, they don't have a lot of authority. They can't really tell states what to do for the most part. But the way that they do that, the way that you can make change is through money. So lots of different things in foster care, you're entitled, or the states are entitled to draw down some federal reimbursement. And what the feds can say is, okay, states, if you don't do it this way, you can't draw down our money. So they're not necessarily telling the state what to do, but they're kind of controlling what happens, because lots of states, including California, really rely on that federal money. And so they have to comply with the federal law in order to draw down the federal money. And so that's kind of where, where to put the focus in the federal law. And kind of sticking with our theme of disproportionality, this was put into Biden's proposed budget, $100 million in grants that states can apply for to advance race equity in the child welfare system. And so this is proposed in Biden's budget, and it's something that we saw and immediately wanted to weigh in on. So we've now been contacting different legislators, including our own, and saying like, hey, we saw that Biden put this in his proposed budget. this is something we really want to see be in the final budget. We hope you'll support it. So that's a way that we can weigh in at the federal level, that would have an impact, directly in our state. That's all I have. So I know we're supposed to end at 2. If anyone has any questions, I will stay on for a minute or 2. If anyone might, Taylor, can people unmute themselves and just ask things if they want?
Definitely.
Okay.
Go for
Okay,
it, guys.
yes,
Feel free to
please.
unmute.
Feel free to unmute and comment, questions, anything.
Free yourself from the mute button. Any questions
Any
from?
questions, thoughts?
Hi, thank you so much for coming in and having this talk with us. I was just wondering if we wanted to get more involved, especially at the organization that you're in. Are there any possible volunteer opportunities or some sort of like internships that we can possibly go into?
Yeah, we do. We have an undergrad program, and we also have a law school law clerk program where we take law clerks during the summer. And then we also have a post-bar law clerk program if people have taken the bar but don't have a job lined up yet. It's like a 14-week paid post-bar law clerk program where you can do the work that we do. So there's a lot of different ways to volunteer and get involved. And I think it's all on our website, and if it's not, you can definitely email me.
Thanks, Randall. Appreciate that question. Any other questions? I have a question, Sue. Do you have to be a lawyer to do this type of work?
Definitely not, no. You don't have to be a lawyer to be a policymaker. Lots of policymakers are not lawyers. Lots are, so it's definitely, is a career path for lawyers who are interested, who don't necessarily want to be in court. But yeah, there's lots of policymakers who are not lawyers, and yeah, there's policymakers who just start right out of school, either working in a legislative office or working for a board supervisor like Taylor did, and kind of learning the landscape of politics that way. And then there's also graduate programs specifically in policy where you can learn more about being a policymaker. Again, there's some overlap with law, but you don't necessarily have to be a lawyer.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. And hopefully you will all go out and do wonderful things and change the world. And please feel free to email me if you have any questions.